It was in the late summer of 1936 when Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective, with his immaculate moustaches and impeccable suits, found himself once again drawn into the orbit of mystery. A letter, delicately perfumed and stamped with the crest of the exclusive lakeside retreat, had arrived at his London flat. Within, an invitation promised a weekend of rest and refinement by the cool waters of Windermere, in the company of distinguished guests. Poirot, who rarely sought leisure, accepted partly for a Hastings insistence, and partly because he never underestimated the curious nature of human gatherings. Upon arrival, the retreat revealed itself to be charming yet curiously isolated. Nestled among tall pines and misty waters, its cabins stood in orderly rows, save one, cabin 13. Though seemingly ordinary, it carried with it a whisper of foreboding. The staff spoke of superstitions, of guests who avoided it, and of odd disturbances in the night. Hastings dismissed it as idle chatter, yet Poirot's sharp eyes caught unease in the faces of those who laughed too quickly. The weekend began with gaiety, fine dinners, polite conversation, and subtle rivalries simmering beneath the surface. But as shadows lengthened over the lake, so too did the mood. A disappearance, a body found, and secrets unspoken would soon transform this holiday into a stage for tragedy. For where cabin 13 stood, danger lurked, and only Poirot's little grey cells could pierce the veil of deception before it was too late. Chapter 1. The invitation. Letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon of no particular consequence. Drab clouds, a sulking sun, and the muffled clip of hoofs along the street below. Hercule Poirot had just adjusted the angle of a vase so that its chrysanthemums faced precisely due east when the post rattled the brass flap. He glanced at the envelope, appreciated its neat geometry, and handed it to me with a small flourish. For you, Hastings, or for me. The perfume pronounces itself with confidence. It was addressed, in a steady, undecorated hand, to Monsieur Hercule Poirot. The paper was thick, faintly ivory, and bore in the upper left corner an embossed crest, a stylized swan riding a ripple of water, encircled by the words Lakeside Retreat. A pale yellow scent of verbena lifted from the flap when I broke the seal. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Verbena is the choice of someone who wishes to seem simple while being anything but. Inside was a single sheet. The type was clean. The margins exact a printer's pride. Monsieur Poirot, the Lakeside Retreat has the honor to invite you and a guest to spend a quiet weekend by our waters, from Friday to Monday. In the last light of summer, we would be delighted to offer you cabin 7, with every comfort and discretion. Our guests this weekend are few and distinguished. We trust the tranquility of the pines, and the lake will provide rest for the mind and balm for the spirit. Respectfully, Adelaide Hartwell, manageress, a guest. Poirot murmured. But of course, the good Hastings is included. They flatter, they tempt. And yet why this generosity? Publicity, perhaps, I suggested. You've turned away half of London's newspapers in the last month. An establishment might fancy attaching itself to your fame. His moustaches preened at that, but his eyes were thoughtful. You read, but not entirely. Mon ami. Smell again. Verbena, yes. But there is also something else. He lifted the envelope to his nose. Lake clay. Not mud from a city gutter clay. Fine and pale, like slip from a potter's wheel. Note also the very faint rust-red smear along the inside seam. Iron-rich water, or a careless pin, pricked a finger and bled through. The stamp is placed a millimetre askew, which speaks of a left-handed person in haste. You deduce all that from a stamp, from the manner of placing it, and from the letter itself. It is too correct. Excessive correctness is its own advertisement. He turned the invitation over, studying the crest. I saw that the swan's beak was darker than the rest of the embossment, as if pressed twice. Poirot noticed as well. Someone wished the swan to be certain of its outline. The symbol must matter. You're not thinking it's a trap. He smiled. If it is a trap, it is at least a gracious one, and it promises cuisine that does not offend civilization. Besides, you have been sighing for fresh air and the noble art of fishing. Abure. Hastings, Shall we be Lord? I confess the mention of water and pines roused me more than I would have admitted. London in late summer grows oppressive, like a room where too many people have been speaking too loudly. I'll ring for a Bradshaw, I said, already envisioning a rod and the subtle arc of a line in flight. Let us first ring the retreat, Poirot said. He dialed and, after a moment, inclined his head. Madame Hartwell, Bonne, Poirot here. Yes, the very one. But naturally, he listened with those small, elegant nods that always impressed the uninitiated. Cabin 7, you propose. We accept. Indeed, I comprehend. Until Friday. Then, he replaced the receiver and looked at me mildly. A curiosity. Cabin 7 is unavoidably occupied by a gentleman who arrives tomorrow and leaves how convenient on Monday morning. We are, instead, to have Cabin 5. I am invited, specifically, to admire the view from the terrace at sunset on Friday. Madame Hartwell sounded as if the setting sun were her own achievement. Perhaps it is as good as advertised. Or perhaps, Poirot said, someone wishes me placed not in Cabin 7. We shall see. We left on Friday by the early train, a civilized conveyance that allowed Poirot to complain, with undiminished vigor, about draughts, teapots that dribbled, and the metropolitan vulgarity of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. I am fond of railway carriages. They promise beginnings. Across from us, a thin clergyman read a novel of the more dramatic sort, with his hand discreetly covering the dust jacket. At the far end, a square-shouldered man with a cavalry moustache stared at the landscape with the resentful air of one who has been dismissed from the army without being asked. Observe, Poirot murmured, how England arranges itself. The parson hides his indulgence, the soldier displays his grievance, and the fields pretend to be forever. You're in rare spirits, only care for once. I find, Hastings, that those who invite you charmingly often expect something in return. What can a hotel want from you besides the shine of your name? He did not answer, but adjusted his cuffs so that precisely a quarter-inch of linen showed beyond his sleeve dot at the lakeside station. A motor launch awaited, varnished wood, polished brass, and a young woman at the tiller, whose practical hands suggested she'd tied more than one knot in a gale. Miss Nora Fenwick. She introduced herself when we presented our invitation. I help out sometimes. The retreat is just round the far point. You are very kind, Poirot said, bowing. Mademoiselle, you navigate as one born to it. Nora smiled, showing a gap between her front teeth that gave her a cheerful, conspiratorial look. If I'd been born for it, I'd have chosen a warmer lake. This one has moods. My husband says it's a lady with a temper. Your husband works at the retreat. Peter's the handyman. There's not a bolt or hinge he hasn't coaxed into virtue. The launch nosed across the water. Pines rose densely along the shore, their reflections lengthened into cool green smears by a breeze that came and went like a passing thought. The buildings of the retreat revealed themselves in steps, a long low lodge with wide windows, a scatter of cabins set among boulders and mountain laurel, and somewhat apart one cabin at the edge of a small cove, whose number I could not see at first. Then the boatyard, and the figure at the footpath shifted, and the brass numeral on the door flashed. 13. Unlucky, I said lightly. Nora's hand tightened on the tiller. We don't say that here, she replied with a little too much briskness. It's just a number. Poirot followed her gaze to the cabin. A man stood near its steps, head bent, speaking to a woman whose hat brim cast her face in shade. The man had the trim, alert bearing of the cavalry moustache from our train. The woman wore a line of pearls that caught the late light with a cat's eye glint. They turned as the launch glided past. The man nodded curtly. The woman smiled without warmth. Guests. I said *some, Nora replied, and a few locals who are friends of the retreat. Mrs. Hartwell will tell you everything. She tells everyone everything. We alighted at a small pier. Adelaide Hartwell, the manageress, met us with a smile that had been ironed before use. She was a tall woman, handsome in a firm way, dressed in a dark green suit that sat on her shoulders as if it had been persuaded. "Monsieur Poirot, how honored we are." She extended a hand, palm down, like a letter presented for stamping. "And Captain Hastings." "Merely Mr. Hastings," I said, shaking with more warmth than she offered. "Of course. Forgive me. We have a Captain Sykes among our guests. The title is on my tongue. You must allow me to present your cabin. We have arranged everything." As we walked the gravel path, Poirot looked about with quiet appreciation that would have satisfied any designer. The angles were orderly, the paths symmetric, the beds of late roses balanced by ferns. "It is very composed," he said. "That is our pride," Mrs. Hartwell returned. "We offer repose to minds otherwise disordered by the world. Our cabins are arranged to preserve privacy. Cabin 5, here, for you on a little rise. A view of the western cove. You see the terrace below. We gather there at sunset. It is our moment of communion." "The word is suggestive," Poirot said. "Suggestive of nothing more than light upon water," she answered. "Or, and their cabin 13. Please pay no heed to local nonsense. We do not encourage superstition." "Local nonsense?" I asked. She smiled thinly. "Every place has its stories. 13 is prone to them. Mr. Fenwick Peter has been tightening the door hinges this afternoon. Oldwood protests, you know, and guests can be imaginative. We entered our cabin. Everything shown. 2 armchairs faced the lake. A neat writing desk stood by the window. The bedspreads were crisp, the curtains unrumpled, the grate swept. But it was the bowl on the little table that took Poirot's attention. Verbena leaves and white petals floating on water. He touched one leaf with a fingertip. "Your signature, Madame, a little fragrance for welcome," Mrs. Hartwell said. "We like themes." When she had left us to refresh and join the terrace at sunset, Poirot remained standing, looking through the window toward the cove. I joined him. Cabin 13 crouched at the water's edge, its porch shaded by 2 pines, whose trunks leaned toward one another like whispering confidence. The brass numeral gleamed perhaps overbright, as if newly polished. A curtain inside moved slightly and stilled. "Did you see that?" I asked. "The breeze," Poirot said, but his eyes did not leave the window. "Or someone testing whether we observe." "You think we are observed?" "Always," he said mildly, "but especially when invited." A knock sounded. A young man with sun-reddened cheeks and a toolbox in hand stood at the door. "Peter Fenwick," he said, touching his cap. "Mrs. Hartwell said to see if you needed anything set right." "Everything is perfection," Poirot assured him. "It must keep you busy, achieving so much perfection." Peter laughed softly. "It's like painting the 4th bridge. So when you finish, you start again. There's always a hinge to hush or a latch to teach manners." "Excuse me, cabin 13's door has been shrieking like a gull. I'll see to it before the sun's gone." He lifted his box and went. We watched him descend the slope and pass under the leaning pines. As he neared the cabin, the door shuddered, then swung inward a fraction, as if a hand barely visible had pulled it. Peter paused, looked toward the trees, then entered. Poirot exhaled, almost inaudibly. "Come, Hastings, let us make ourselves presentable for the sunset." "Do you expect something to happen at sunset?" "I expect only what is already arranged," he replied. "And someone has been arranging very carefully indeed." Chapter 2. Cabin 13. The evening at the retreat opened with a certain ceremony. Guests gathered along the terrace, glasses of pale sherry in hand, while the sun dipped behind the ridges in slow, deliberate majesty. The lake accepted the fire of the sky without protest, and the mirrored colour shimmered so vividly that Hastings, standing beside me, muttered something about Turner's canvases. Poirot, of course, was less enraptured by art than by human composition. His sharp eyes wandered not over the water, but over the people who had assembled. Each guest drawn out of their private cabin to this appointed moment. There was Captain Sykes, the soldierly fellow we had glimpsed on the train, his chin lifted and moustache bristling, if he was still on parade. At his side hovered Mrs. Valerie Harcourt, the lady with the pearl necklace, her expression composed, but her gaze restless, always flicking toward the path to cabin 13. Next was Dr. Ellery Marsh, a thin, nervous man with spectacles and the habit of adjusting them whenever silence threatened. He spoke to no one until pressed, then offered only cautious words, as if every sentence were an experiment. There was also Miss Clara Whitfield, a young woman with a notebook perpetually clutched in her hands. A writer, she announced, working on a modern romance. Though murder sells better. Her laugh was sharp, almost metallic. To others stood apart Mr. Lionel Graves, a solicitor of middle years, whose heavy brow and sombre demeanour suggested long practice in disappointing clients, and Mrs. Graves, who remained a shadow beside him, her voice scarcely more than a whisper when she greeted us. And presiding over all, in her dark green suit and firm smile, was Mrs. Hartwell, the manageress, who moved among her guests with the assurance of a hostess certain that every detail belonged to her control. Mesdames et messieurs, she announced at last, raising her glass, our little tradition, the retreat welcomes you with the lake sunset. May it wash away all discord and leave only calm. Unless, Miss Whitfield murmured audibly enough, the lake has other plans. A hush followed, broken by Captain Sykes' short laugh. Superstition, my dear girl. Lakes have no plans. Yet as he spoke, from the far cove, there came the faintest creak, the unmistakable sound of a hinge protesting. Every head turned toward cabin 13. Its door, visible from the terrace, had opened a fraction, then closed again with a shudder. Nora Fenwick, still at her post by the pier, looked up sharply. Her husband, Peter, emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on a rag. "Only me," he called, though his voice carried uneasily. "Just tightening things." Conversation resumed, but with a different note, for something unspoken seemed to circle around the unlucky number. Poirot leaned close to me. "Observe, Hastings. Each person reacts not to the door, but to what they imagine beyond it." "And what do you imagine?" "I imagine," he replied, "that cabin 13 is the stage upon which someone will perform a drama, and that we, willy-nilly, are in the audience." Dinner was served in the lodge dining hall, a charming affair of candlelight, polished silver, and the aroma of trout freshly caught from the lake. The conversation, however, was less harmonious than the cuisine. Captain Sykes, seated near Mrs. Harcourt, told lengthy stories of regimental campaigns. Mrs. Harcourt smiled politely, but her eyes strayed continually toward Dr. Marsh, who seemed determined to avoid them. Miss Whitfield scribbled notes under the tablecloth, occasionally looking up to ask sudden, intrusive questions. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, do you believe jealousy sufficient motive for a murder, or does money always trump passion?" Mr. Graves frowned. "Murder is not a subject for the dinner table, madam. On the contrary," she replied, "it's the only subject that interests the public." Poirot, unruffled, sampled the trout with satisfaction. "It is always the same," he said gently, "the appetites of the body and the appetites of the imagination. Both must be fed, and both may be poisoned." The remark was met with a silence, broken only by the clink of a spoon. When dessert had been served and the guests began drifting toward the lounge, Poirot and I lingered. Through the tall windows, the cabins lay quiet under the rising moon. Yet again, from the direction of cabin 13, there came a faint sound, not a hinge this time, but the scrape of wood against wood, as if a drawer had been pulled sharply open. Poirot set down his cup. "I think, Hastings, that we must take a little walk before retiring." The night was cool, the scent of pine sharp in the air. Gravel crunched softly underfoot as we approached the cabins. Most were dark now, the guests having retired, but at cabin 13 a thin line of light gleamed under the door. Poirot halted, raising a finger. "You hear?" I listened. A murmur of voices, then a sudden silence. After a moment, footsteps within, and the light was extinguished. "Someone doesn't wish to be overheard," I whispered. "Exactement." Poirot's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "And you notice, Hastings, how even in silence, the truth speaks." We returned to our cabin without further incident, though I confess I looked back more than once. The door of cabin 13 remained shut, mute and secretive under the shadow of its leaning pines. Morning brought a shift in mood. Sunlight poured across the lake, scattering the unease of the night. Guests emerged in light spirits, speaking of walks, boating, and fishing. Yet, over breakfast, Mrs. Hartwell mentioned almost casually, "Curious. The occupant of cabin 13 is not at table. Perhaps overslept," said Sykes. "Perhaps," she agreed. But her tone carried a weight Poirot did not miss. He dabbed his lips with a napkin. "Madame, this guest, who is he?" "A Mr. Alistair Kent, a businessman of some repute. He arrived late last evening, by private car. I placed him in cabin 13, because he requested privacy." "Privacy," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Sometimes it is a mask for solitude, sometimes for concealment." Mrs. Hartwell's smile thinned. "At the retreat, monsieur, we do not pry." Poirot inclined his head politely. Yet as we stepped outside, I saw him glance once more toward the cove where cabin 13 crouched in its shadows, as though the detective's little grey cells were already stirring, piecing together patterns invisible to the rest of us. Chapter 3. A disappearance mooring at the retreat had the fresh, industrious air of a new page. Light sprang from the lake in clean ripples. The pines shook down a mild fragrance, as though tidying themselves for inspection. Guests arranged their pastimes with polite vigor: boats, rods, walking sticks, while Mrs. Hartwell, green-suited and composed, presided with a ledger under one arm and also mistled. It was near 10 o'clock when the composure began to fray. "Curious," Mrs. Hartwell said again, though the word now sounded brittle. "Mr. Alistair Kent has not requested breakfast. Perhaps he is a late riser," murmured Mrs. Graves. "Businessmen rise early," said Mr. Graves with bureaucratic certainty. Captain Sykes, who had been lecturing Nora Fenwick on the proper storage of oars, glanced toward the cove. "If the chap values privacy, he won't thank us for rattling his doorknob." Miss Whitfield snapped her notebook shut. "Privacy is a luxury until it becomes a story," she announced. "Shall we look in?" Mrs. Hartwell's smile thinned. "We do not intrude upon a gentleman's rest. Peter," she had caught sight of her handyman, "have you seen Mr. Kent this morning?" Peter Fenwick shook his head. "No, ma'am. Put a new screw in the porch step at 7. Cabin was quiet. Poirot, who had been studying the mime of light across the lodge windows with an attention that would have flattered an architect, turned delicately. "Madame, if the gentleman is indisposed, a responsibility would rest with the house." Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. Her composure was a cathedral built of policies. One could feel the architecture resist. "Very well. For discretion's sake, just to ensure no unpleasantness, Peter, bring the master key." We walked, some of us with frank curiosity, down the gravel path and under the leaning pines that guarded cabin 13 like conspirators. The brass numeral glinted. A spider's thread, strung from the corner of the porch railing to the door frame, trembled in the faint breeze. "Observe," Poirot murmured, very softly. "A web unbroken." "I don't follow," I confessed. He did not answer. Peter inserted the key, coughed, and opened the door. The air inside was faintly cool, shaded by curtains drawn to a soft dimness. It had that particular stillness of a room keeping its own counsel. A suitcase stood open on the luggage stand, shirts folded with a precision that suggested a valet's training had not been wasted on its owner. A monogram AK glimmered on a silver-backed brush. On the desk, 2 cups stood on a tray, one rinsed and set upside down, one upright and ringed with the ghost of coffee. Between them lay a matchbook with a stylized swan. "Why 2 cups?" Miss Whitfield breathed, bright with narrative triumph. "Because there were 2 persons," said Poirot, "or one very careful person pretending to be 2. The Rimsey has the faintest impression of lipstick." Mrs. Harcourt, who wore pearls as if they were her right, went perfectly still. Her face, however, did not move. Poirot bent, viewed the mark from a polite distance, and straightened. "A pale shade, not the dramatic taste, Hastings. Something that wishes not to announce itself." Dr. Ellery Marsh had followed us in reluctance. Now he steepled his fingers, as if to hide their tremor. "Perhaps Mr. Kent entertained a lady." "That is neither our affair nor." Nor unusual. Unusual. Captain Sykes snorted. In a respectable establishment, sir, a gentleman keeps his lady to dinner, not to his bedchamber. Miss Whitfield scribbled. Poirot ignored the currents and drifted to the window. Its latch bore the marist whitened scrape, the sort that comes when metal meets metal with haste rather than habit. On the sill, where the pines shaded out the sun, a smudge of pale clay had dried in a crescent. He tapped it with a fingertip. The lake bed speaks, and this, he lifted the corner of the rug by the door with a handkerchief, has been moved. See, the pine needle's mark, where it lay yesterday. Peter stepped in, uneasy. Sir, I swept last night. If that rug slid, it did so after. Just so, Poirot said. The wardrobe was neat, the bed unrumpled, a press suit hung ready. On the knit stand lay a book of shipping quotations, with a page marked by a railway ticket from the previous afternoon. Under the bed, nothing but the dust's unadventurous piece. No Mr. Kent. Mrs. Hartwell's control failed her in a small, hard exhalation. This is absurd. He cannot have vanished. On the contrary, said Poirot gently, he can have vanished very well. Mr. Graves frowned. There is no reason to presume any mischief. There is reason, Poirot returned, to presume an arrangement. He nodded toward the cups. We will ask the kitchen who carried this tray and when, and we will learn who wears a restrained lipstick. Many women do. Mrs. Harcourt said evenly. Many, Poirot agreed, with a small, apologetic bow. With Mrs. Hartwell's permission, more rung than given. Peter counted the keys. The door could be locked from within. It was not. The window was unlatched. Could have gone for an early swim, he offered, but his voice held no conviction. Mr. Fenwick, Poirot said, you were here at 7:30 and again now. What is different? Peter, to his credit, thought. The porch mat's crooked, he said slowly. I straighten it when I pass. And oh, there's a nick on the latch that wasn't there yesterday. He showed us a fresh scratch, bright against the dull brass dot. Nora had hovered by the threshold, unwilling to invade. Peter, she said, did you put the rowboats to rights after dinner? Then one's out, she said grimly. I counted them an hour ago, and there's a space where number 3 should be. Mrs. Hartwell bristled. Boats are 4 guests. A gentleman may row without filing a notice in triplicate. Not without oars, Nora replied. And the number 3 pair is missing from the rack as well. Captain Sykes rolled his shoulder, like a man checking a former wound. If Kent took a boat, he took it before dawn. I walked the terrace at 5. All cabins were quiet. You are an early riser, Captain? Poirot asked. Habit, Sykes said briskly. A soldier's best friend. A soldier's second best friend, Miss Whitfield put in sweetly. Being a good alibi, Sykes coloured, and Mrs. Graves, in a whisper that might have been kindness, murmured something about the morning light. Mr. Graves cleared his throat as if to read a statute. Poirot crossed to the desk again. The matchbook Swanner, twin to the crest on our invitation, showed a faint rust-red smear, a long one in a flap. He opened it delicately. A single match was missing. The striker bore a narrow, vertical scrape. Left-handed, he said absently. I started. Like the letter writer. Perhaps, Poirot murmured, eyes distant. Or perhaps there are many left hands at work. We fanned out along the cove. Nora led the search, her practical manner suppressing fear into a series of tasks. Check the boathouse, count the lifebelts, scan the reeds. Dr. Marsh, despite his nervousness, proved useful. He had a doctor's eye for detail and found, near the waterline, a small, flattened circle of clay impressed with a patterned sole. Herringbone, he reported. Hobnailed service shoes often carry a herringbone, Sykes said. Then, catching the inference, added sharply, but so do half the brogues in England. Poirot examined the mark. Weight evenly distributed. Not a man running. Someone who stood here a moment, then stepped into what? He scanned the reeds. Into a boat, I think. That was drawn close. He straightened, eyes half-lidded, as if listening to an internal recital. He meets a guest in his cabin. They drink coffee. They depart by the window, so as not to be seen at the door. They walk to the water. Careful, careful. The rug moves. The latch scratches. The spider's line remains. And then the boat. Why not the door? I asked. Because, mon ami, the door is for those who wish to be seen, he said. This is a disappearance that wishes to be believed. A call from Nora interrupted us. Over here. We hurried to the boathouse. On the lip of the dock, caught in a splinter, was a thread fine, nearly invisible of something pale. Poirot lifted it with tweezers Peter produced from his toolbox. Against his handkerchief it showed faintly luminous. Silk, he said. From a dress or from a string of pearls. Miss Whitfield finished, eyes sliding to Mrs. Harcourt's throat. The pearls lay there as innocently as Summerhale. Mrs. Harcourt did not touch them. You are all mad, she said calmly. I return to my cabin at 11. Ask anyone. We shall, Poirot said, tucking the thread away. And we shall ask also who saw Mr. Kent after dinner, and who did not. The lake offered us nothing further then. A water bird skimmed low and vanished. Mrs. Hartwell, pale under her precision, sent Peter and Nora along the north shore and dispatched Mr. Graves to telephone the local constable. Quietly, discreetly, naturally, Dr. Marsh volunteered his services in case of some medical urgency, which no one defined. Captain Sykes stalked the terrace with offended authority. Miss Whitfield composed headlines in the margins of Conscience. By noon, the sun made a mockery of unease. Lunch was served, no one ate. Poirot declined food and, instead, requested of Mrs. Hartwell the kitchen's tray records. Mrs. Lively took coffee to cabin 13 at 10:15 last night. Mrs. Hartwell reported after a hurried inquiry. Mr. Kent asked for it on the telephone. She says she heard voices. Whose? Poirot asked. She couldn't say. A gentleman and a lady. Did she see the lady leave? No, Mrs. Hartwell said tightly. Mrs. Lively is not a spy. Non, Poirot agreed softly. But she's a witness. We returned to the cove as the wind freshened. The lake, so serene at breakfast, had acquired a small, choppy impatience. Reeds whispered in a tongue I did not understand. Poirot stood very still, as if exactitude could coax truth from the air. Look, I said suddenly. Something winked in the shallows. A pale sun-caught glint among the stones. Peter waded into his ankles and bent. When he rose, water ran from his hands. In his palm lay a ring, gold, heavy, set with a dark green stone, carved with a crest the device of a swan riding a ripple. Mrs. Hartwell swayed. That is Mr. Kent's signet. He pressed it into the register last night. Poirot's eyes hardened, though his voice remained almost tender. So our swan prints itself in sorrow. He took the ring, turned it once, and offered it to Mrs. Hartwell. Madame, we shall require the constable at once. Mr. Kent has not merely gone for a row. Then where is he? Mrs. Hartwell whispered. Poirot looked toward the wide water, which had turned the grey of a closed door. Where the lake keeps its appointments, he said, and where, I fear, we must now keep ours. Chapter 4. A body by the Laketh retreat, which only the previous day had seemed a sanctuary of elegance and repose, had by mid-afternoon acquired the brittle hush of a drawing-room where scandal is suspected. Each guest went about with a deliberate air of nonchalance, yet all eyes stole toward the cove where cabin 13 crouched under its whispering pines. Poirot, more tranquil than any of us, arranged his moustaches with mathematical exactness and murmured, one should never mistake apparent calm for true calm. Hastings. In still water, a stone may already be sinking. It was Nora Fenwick who gave the cry. She had gone to check the moorings of the missing boat. Her voice, sharp against the hush of the lake, brought us running along the pier. She pointed to the far reeds, where something pale bobbed against the stalks. Peter was already wading in, his trousers soaked to the thigh. With effort he drew it to the bank. It was the body of Alistair Kent. His eyes stared wide at the sky, unblinking, the skin already tinged with the grey sheen of death. His jacket was missing, shirt clinging damp against his chest. One hand was curled as though grasping at an invisible rope. The other bore a bruise across the knuckles. Most striking of all was the wound, a thin line at the back of the skull, hidden partly by his wet hair. To neat for an accident, Mrs. Hartwell pressed a hand to her lips. "Dear God," she whispered. Captain Sykes barked. "Fetch the constable. Secure the place." His soldier's instinct craved orders, but his face betrayed a flash of unease. Poirot crouched beside the body, his gaze keen and undisturbed. "You see, Hastings, not a drowning. He was struck first, then placed in the water. Observe the soil beneath the nails. It is not from the lake bed, but from the coast's higher path." He struggled. Dr. Marsh bent reluctantly. "The wound is consistent with a blunt instrument. Death would have been swift, but why place him in the water?" "To create confusion," Poirot said softly, "to make us believe in accident. But accidents do not arrange bruises so deliberately." Miss Whitfield scribbled furiously, her eyes shining. "Murder at a lakeside retreat. The very headline writes itself." "Madam," Graves said sternly, "a man is dead. You might temper your enthusiasm." Her smile was sharp. "The public does not temper theirs." Poirot rose, brushing a pine needle from his sleeve. "We must know who last saw Mr. Kent alive, who visited cabin 13, who would gain from his silence." His gaze lingered a fraction of a second upon Mrs. Harcourt's pearls, then shifted as if nothing had been noted. Mrs. Hartwell, struggling for composure, ordered the body carried discreetly to the lodge. But the damage was done, the retreat's tranquility was broken, and each guest moved now with the wary step of a player in a game whose rules were uncertain, but whose stakes had suddenly become fatal. As dusk descended, Poirot and I stood again on the terrace. The lake, darkening under a copper sky, seemed to hold its breath. Poirot folded his arms. "It begins, mon ami," he said. "The curtains rise, the actors take their places, and the mystery of cabin 13 declares itself in earnest." Chapter 5. Poirot takes command. The discovery of Alistair Kent's body transformed the retreat into a place at once cloistered and exposed. Its manicured lawns and still waters seemed unchanged, yet every tree whispered suspicion, every ripple threatened to conceal a clue. By nightfall, the constable from Windermere had arrived, an honest fellow named Sergeant Wilkes, whose country boots looked unsuited to the retreat's polished parquet. "It'll be my duty to take statements," he said, tugging his cap respectfully at Poirot. "But they tell me you've a name for solving such matters." "Sir," Poirot inclined his head, "I shall assist only with the little grey cells. The authority is yours, Sergeant, yet if you permit, we may keep the matter quiet lest the press arrive before the truth." Wilkes agreed, and so the retreat was sealed into its own uneasy theatre. The guests were gathered in the dining hall, its lamps glowing against the dusk. Poirot stood at the head of the long table like a conductor about to summon the orchestra. "Mes amis," he began gently, "a grave event has occurred. Monsieur Alistair Kent is dead, not by misadventure, but by the hand of another. Each of you may hold some piece of truth, however small. We shall speak together, calmly, so that truth may emerge." The silence that followed was dense. Then, with soldierly impatience, Captain Sykes rose. "If there's a murderer among us, best to flush him out quickly. No use in mollycoddling." Poirot's gaze softened. "The murderer, mon capitaine, is already flushed by his own conscience. What remains is to know his identity." The captain and the Lady Sykes was first questioned. He admitted to seeing Kent late in the lounge after dinner. He was restless, Sykes said. Asked if I'd play cards. I declined. Went to bed by 10:30. Alone. Miss Whitfield's pen scratched. No corroboration. Then the captain stiffened. "I require none." Poirot let the silence sting before turning to Mrs. Harcourt. She sat composed, pearls catching the light like frost. "I saw Mr. Kent shortly after," she said evenly, "in the garden path. We spoke of the moon. That is all." Poirot's brow lifted. "And after I retired," she replied, alone, yet the faintest flicker of her eyes toward Dr. Marsh, who avoided them, did not escape the detective. The doctor's uneased. Marsh fidgeted with his spectacles. "I heard voices near cabin 13 around 11. A man's, then a woman's. I cannot swear whose. And you, doctor, where were you?" Poirot asked. "In my cabin, reading." He flushed. "Medical texts. If you require the titles, I can provide them." Poirot inclined his head, but made no note. We shall see, Doctor. The solicitor and his wife Graves declared that he and his wife had retired early. We played a game of chess. Mrs. Graves can confirm. Mrs. Graves, pale and soft-spoken, nodded obediently. Yes. We did not stir, yet our hands twisted in her lap, as though remembering differently. Poirot's moustaches twitched. Chess is a fine game. One may conceal strategy even from one's partner. The novelist's delight Miss Whitfield, far from cowed, leaned forward eagerly. I heard nothing until Nora's cry at the pier. But I say, M. Poirot, isn't it delicious? A vanished guest, a body in the reeds. It has all the makings of a bestseller. Perhaps, Poirot said softly, but let us hope the ending is not written in more blood. The Fenwicks roll finally. Peter and Nora Fenwick gave their accounts. Peter had repaired cabin 13's door around 7:30, then retired to his own quarters. Nora claimed she had seen Kent only briefly. When he nodded to her from the path, Poirot asked her, "And the missing boat?" She confirmed it had gone sometime after dusk. I counted them at 10, all present. By dawn, one was missing. Poirot tapped the table. So between 10 and dawn, Kent left door was taken from his cabin to the lake. We must fix the hour more precisely. Poirot reflects when the questioning ended. The guests dispersed uneasily. Poirot, however, lingered in the dining hall, staring at the silver candelabra. You saw their faces. Hastings, he murmured. The soldier, proud and hasty. The lady with pearls, so controlled yet so restless. The doctor, trembling with secrets. The solicitor, too careful. And the young writer, she enjoys the spectacle too much. Each wears a mask, but the masks are not seamless. He walked to the window. The lake gleamed with moonlight. Cabin 13 a black shadow on its cove. Poirot's finger traced the air, the lipstick on the cup, the scrape on the latch, the clay on the sill. These are the voices of objects, Hastings. They tell me that Kent was not alone, and that the hand that struck him did not intend merely death, but confusion. And do you know whose hand? I asked. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Not yet, but soon. The lake keeps its secrets poorly, mon ami, and tomorrow we shall let the light interrogate what shadows conceal. Chapter 6. Secrets in the shadows. Morning broke pale and uncertain, as though the lake itself shared our disquiet. A mist clung low across the water, veiling the far shore in gauze. The retreat's guests moved through breakfast in strained silence, each conscious that they now dined not merely as companions, but as potential suspects. Poirot, immaculate as ever in a grey suit and polished shoes that gleamed even in the mist, sat with perfect calm. He buttered his toast in meticulous strokes, but his eyes sharp. Curious drifted constantly from face to face. Secrets, Hastings, he murmured, when the others had drifted from the table. They rise like bubbles in champagne. One may attempt to swallow them down, but they escape all the same. A lady's confession later that morning. Mrs. Harcourt saw Poirot in the lounge. Her pearls trembled faintly at her throat as she lowered herself into a chair. M. Poirot, she began, her voice cool but urgent. I must confide something, or else gossip will poison me before truth does. Poirot inclined his head. You have my attention, madame. She drew in a breath. I knew Alistair Kent. We had met in London at a gallery, last spring. He pursued me, persistently, but I did not encourage him. When I saw him here, I was startled. He claimed coincidence. I did not believe him. Poirot's eyes softened. You feared scandal. I feared recognition, she admitted. I spoke to him only briefly that night. He insisted we talk further, but I refused. I returned to my cabin, unlocked the door. Poirot noted this gravely. And the pearls? Madame, were they always in your possession? She blinked at him, then pressed her lips. They were a gift, from my husband, years ago. Yet the faintest hesitation lingered, like perfume after a lady has left the room. The doctor's anxiety beknew Poirot had summoned Dr. Marsh for a walk along the terrace. The man's spectacles fogged in the damp air, and his hands shook as he fumbled with a cigarette. You are nervous, doctor, Poirot observed gently. I dislike police business, Marsh muttered. It unearths too much, or too close. Poirot asked. Marsh stopped. paling. Very well. I treated Kent once before, in London. He came to me with symptoms. Matters of the heart is heart. I mean, not romance. A condition he preferred to keep secret. He was not a well man. Poirot's eyes sharpened. So his death could be mistaken for illness. Yes, Marsh admitted. But not with a head wound. That was deliberate. Still, if it became known I had treated him, suspicion might fall unfairly on me. Poirot laid a hand lightly on the man's sleeve. The truth, doctor, is never so dangerous as the concealment of truth. The solicitor's papers in the afternoon. Mr. Graves sat on the lodge veranda, sorting methodically through a briefcase. His wife sat beside him, silent, her hands folded like a penitent's. Poirot approached, and Graves looked up with a guarded expression. I am reviewing documents Mr. Kent left in my custody, he said before Poirot could ask. He was negotiating a merger delicate, highly lucrative. I drew the contracts, but he grew evasive, delayed signatures. Then he vanished. Poirot tilted his head. You had business entanglements, then? Graves pursed his lips. Professional only. If he were murdered, it was not for profit, but for passion. That is always the simpler motive. Poirot glanced at Mrs. Graves. She lowered her gaze, but not before a flicker of emotion passed across her face, something like grief or fear. Sometimes, Poirot murmured, passion and profit dance together until one no longer knows which leads. The writer's curiosity at evening, as the lamps were lit. Miss Whitfield cornered Poirot in the lounge with her notebook open. You've a theory, haven't you? She said, her pen poised. You always do. Was it the jealous lover, the betrayed partner, or shall we invent something more theatrical? Secret identities, perhaps? Poirot smiled faintly. Mademoiselle, your imagination is prodigious, but the truth, I assure you, is quite sufficient. She leaned closer. You don't mind if I use this in a story, do you? A detective at a lakeside retreat, a dead financier, a cast of suspects perfect. Poirot's eyes cooled. Write what you will, but remember when one plays with shadows, one sometimes invites them nearer. Miss Whitfield laughed, but uneasily. Poirot reflects when all had retired. I found Poirot pacing our cabin, hands clasped behind his back. You see, Hastings, he said, already the shadows part. Madame Harcourt feared recognition. Dr. Marsh feared his reputation. Monsieur Graves feared financial ruin. And yet another we shall come to that fear's discovery of a passion misplaced. Each secret is a thread, alone, fragile, together, a net, and which thread strangled Kent? I asked. Poirot stopped, moustaches bristling. That, mon ami, is what we must discover before the murderer spins further. For I tell you this Kent's death was but the first act, and in the second, another may fall. The wind pressed against the windows, rattling them like an impatient guest. Outside, cabin 13 crouched in darkness, its secrets still clinging like mist among the pines. Chapter 7. The trap is set be late afternoon. The retreat had acquired the quiet of a theatre between scenes. Servants moved softly, as if their steps might smudge evidence the air itself preserved. Sergeant Wilkes trudged about with conscientious gravity, taking down particulars and leaving behind, like a snail, a neat trail of notes. Yet it was Poirot who occupied the invisible centre. He did not bustle. He adjusted. Tonight, he murmured to me, we shall invite the murderer to make his second move. You expect him or her to act again. But naturally, when a man kills to arrange a story an accident, a disappearance any jar to that story compels a revision. We, mon ami, shall provide the jar. He sent word, through Mrs. Hartwell, that the constabulary would return at first light with men to drag the shallows and search the boathouse more scientifically. The announcement, received at the terrace just before dinner, produced a small harvest of reactions. Captain Sykes approved too loudly. Mr. Graves disapproved too correctly. Mrs. Graves paled. Dr. Marsh swallowed. Miss Whitfield fairly vibrated with ideas. And Mrs. Harcourt, the precise, permitted herself the smallest miscalculation. Her fingers rose to her pearls, then dropped again, as if remembering the audience. Afterwards, Poirot made quiet arrangements. With Nora Fennicky examined the boathouse, remarking to casually for truth on the many cracks and hollows where detritus might lodge. He asked Peter to oil the padlock and then, sotto-voce, to leave it just stiff enough that a hurried hand might scratch the brass. He borrowed a hand lantern from Wilkes and asked for a pinch of kitchen flour, if it does not discompose the scones. From Mrs. Hartwell he procured access to cabin 13 for 10 minutes. Madame, no more, and remained inside alone, while I played the sentry without. When he emerged, his eyes glittered. "What have you done?" I asked. "Tidying," he said. "A little chalk where the window latch kisses home. A fine thread across the threshold at ankle height easily broken, easily mended, and on the floor, a breath of flour where a foot will not expect it. You observe, Hastings, that order is the ally of the detective. Disorder is the vice of the criminal. Your trap is what? To catch footprints, to catch intent," he returned. "Footprints are only the autograph of movement." Dusk arrived like a careful curtain. Lamps pricked out along the paths. The lake accepted the moon as if conceding a point. Poirot arranged the stack out with unfussy elegance. Sergeant Wilkes took the shadowed corner of the boathouse, where reeds made a whispering screen. I was placed on the terrace steps with a view of both the cove and cabin 13's door. Poirot himself took a bench by the pines, apparently absorbed in the alignment of the stars. Nora, at his suggestion, busied herself in the lodge, coming and going with enough purpose to appear natural. Peter made a show of testing the pier ropes, then vanished along the farther path to watch the back of the cabins. Remember, Poirot told us beforehand, tonight we collect behavior, not heroes. We do not seize, we see. The household settled. A gramophone stitched a thread of waltz through the lodge windows, was hushed, resumed. Somewhere a glass chinked, a door clicked shut, a cough declared itself, and then regretted it. At 10:30 the terrace emptied. At 11, the lake offered only the small, companionable noises of water touching wood. The first movement came at 11:20. Cabin 13 showed a glow, faint and sourceless as if the room itself emitted light. I started, but Poirot had warned me. He had left, under the desk, the hand lantern shaded to throw a little aura through the curtain seam. To the anxious, a lit cabin is a reproach. A figure detached itself from the darkness near the lodge, the slim, eager line of Miss Clara Whitfield. She glided toward cabin 13, stopped, peered, and then conscience or caution circled back, biting the end of her pencil. A journalist's courage, Poirot had remarked, is inverse to the likelihood of being caught. At 11:30, another shadow took soundings. Dr. Ellery Marsh, spectacles a small ghost on the bridge of his nose. He came partway down the path to the cove, hands in his pockets, then veered off toward the boathouse with the guilty purpose of a man seeking to dispose of a thought. I stiffened. Across the reeds, Wilkes shifted his weight. The doctor hesitated at the padlock. Poirot had left it latched, but not fastened. Marsh lifted it, fiddled, and slipped inside, closing the door behind him with care. Wilkes waited. The seconds stretched. I looked toward Poirot. He did not move. When the door creaked open again, Wilkes stepped forward with a quiet authority that bespoke Fields and Fares rather than melodrama. "Evening, sir. Open late." Marsh started so violently he nearly dropped the small parcel he cradled. Brown paper, string, an embarrassing shape like a loaf too long for decency. Sergeant, let's keep voices low, if you please," Wilkes said. "What's in the bundle?" "Private papers," Marsh managed. "Medical. I wish, good God, man, must you glare? I wish to remove them before the press appears. There is nothing unlawful in that. Nothing unlawful in removing, after hours, what you put there earlier to hide," Wilkes returned. "Come along." Then, they brought the parcel to the pier, where Poirot materialized with the softness of a gentleman in a doorway. He tipped his head to Marsh. "We're saved the trouble of speculation, Doctor. May we see?" Marsh, cornered, handed it over. Inside were papers in deed letters on thick creamstock, a note with Kent's signature, and a small object wrapped in a handkerchief, a pill vial, 3/4 full, labelled in an apothecary's neat hand, Digitalis. "Ah," Poirot murmured, So the heart that troubled Monsieur Kent was known to you, and he what? Wished to trouble you with that knowledge. Marsh's composure, held together by the thinnest fascia, gave way. He threatened to expose my private practice speculations in shares. A foolishness if I did not certify him fit for a certain policy. It was a small corruption, M. Poirot, but corruption all the same. I hid these this afternoon, coward that I am. I came to remove them before they harmed me. Believe me, I did not kill him. Poirot's gaze was not unkind. You see, Hastings, the truth arrives when baited with fear. He turned the vial in his fingers. But this is not the weapon that made the neat wound behind the ear. And the doctor, while this small drama unfolded at the pier, the lantern glow at cabin 13 had worked its chemistry. Another shape now moved, swifter, trimmer, the silhouette of a woman with a certain carriage. She came along the gravel from the lodge side, feet careful, head high. At the door she paused. The key, Poirot had noted, no longer hung on its peg in the office. It had not been required. The window latch would do. I held my breath. The figure's hand reached for the window frame. There was the most delicate click. Then the faintest rasp, the chalk he had placed receiving its confession. She slipped inside, silent, confident. Poirot's whisper rode the cool air. We go, Hastings. We crossed the grass with the hush of conspirators. Up close, the pines gave off a smell like old incense. Poirot touched my sleeve and pointed to the threshold. The thread he had stretched at ankle height hummed once, parted, fell, inside. The shaded lantern made a small island of gold. The room retained the peculiar decency of an impersonal place interrupted. At the desk, bending, was Mrs. Valerie Harcourt. She did not start. She straightened with a composure that would have done credit to a duchess interrupted in prayer. In her right hand was a square of paper. In her left, caught half through the crack of the desk drawer, a thin strand winked, a pearl thread, single and telltale. M. Poirot, she said. You are very tiresome, madame, he returned. I aspire to be useful, not tiresome. You seek to retrieve what should never have been left. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. A lady is permitted to recover her property, even when that property, Poirot said, was torn from her necklace on the night of murder, snagged upon a splinter by the boathouse bench, and left its luminous whisper there. Her eyes flicked one instant only. You have a gift for embroidery. I prefer plain sewing, he said. Observe, he knelt and, with a small brush, lifted from the floor a crescent of flower that showed where a heel had turned tonight, at the desk. Last night, near the window. And I see you are left-handed, madame, am I? Her tone mocked, the matchbook scrape, the stamp on the invitation, the manner in which you just now folded this note always from right to left. His voice gentled. You were here with Monsieur Kent last night. You drank coffee with him. You left by the window and went to the boathouse. Something, an argument, a threat, the string of your pearls caught, a thread remained. Tonight, fearing the dragging of the lake and the search of the cabins, you came to recover what connects you, a single pearl, as if on cue from the fates of melodrama, worked loose from the damaged clasp and rolled, making its delicate syllable across the bare desktop. It struck the matchbook with the swan, and stopped. Mrs. Harcourt looked down at it, as if it were a small, insolent animal. You will make of this what you like, she said. But I did not kill Alistair Kent. Poirot inclined his head. It is possible, madame, that you speak the truth. It is also possible that truth, presently, will ask more of you. He glanced at the paper she held. She offered it with a tiny shrug. I read, a torn note in a man's hand, meet at 11. By the boathouse. No scene. Signed, A.K. your rendezvous. Poirot said softly, and someone else heard of it. From outside, across water, came a small sound, the slow tap of an oar against a hull. Once, twice, as if a boat had nudged a mooring. Poirot's eyes went narrow, pleased and grave. You see, Hastings, he murmured, the trap has more than one tooth. We have drawn out the fear. Now we shall learn whose fear it is. Chapter 8. The little grey soused retreat awoke to tension that clung heavier than the morning mist. Guests avoided one another in the breakfast room, lowering voices, carrying plates to solitary corners. The lake, silver and watchful, reflected their unease. Poirot, however, was at his most serene. He sat at the head of the table, sipping chocolate with an almost exaggerated delicacy. "Observe, Hastings," he said, "how guilty people eat. To fast, too little, or not at all." When Sergeant Wilkes returned from the village with word that additional constables would arrive by noon, Poirot seized the moment. He summoned everyone into the lounge, insisting the matter could not wait. Poirot's assembly *, the guests gathered reluctantly, Mrs. Harcourt stiff and composed, Captain Sykes restless, pacing, Miss Whitfield clutching her notebook like a shield, Dr. Marsh pale, eyes rimmed from sleeplessness, the Graves couple seated together, though Mrs. Graves' fingers twisted constantly at her skirt, Nora and Peter Fenwick standing near the doorway, loyal but wary. Poirot faced them with his customary calm. "Miss Amiss, I have asked you here because the time has come for clarity. Monsieur Kent's death was no accident. It was a murder planned with care, though not, alas, with sufficient intelligence to deceive Hercule Poirot." Gasps, murmurs, shifting feet. Poirot lifted a hand. "Patience. The little grey cells have spoken. Allow me to recount." Reconstructing the night began with the timeline. At 10 o'clock, Kent ordered coffee for two. A lady joined him in cabin 13. Their cups tell us this. One bore the faintest trace of lipstick, a discreet shade. Later, both left the cabin by the door, but by the window. The rug was disturbed, the latch scratched, the spider's web unbroken, thus they avoided being seen. His gaze drifted to Mrs. Harcourt. She sat utterly still. They walked to the boathouse. There, a quarrel occurred. A thread of pearls snagged on the bench and broke. One pearl remained in the reeds. Another thread clung to Kent's coat. Soon after, he was struck on the head with a blunt object, perhaps an oar, perhaps something carried for the purpose. His body was set adrift to suggest drowning. Mrs. Harcourt's lips parted, but Poirot pressed on. Later, the murderer or his accomplice returned to remove evidence. Last night, Mrs. Harcourt entered cabin 13 to retrieve a note of assignation. Dr. Marsh crept to the boathouse to recover papers proving his own small corruption. Each feared exposure, but neither, I think, delivered the fatal blow. The motives unveiled consider motives. Dr. Marsh feared disgrace, yet his secret was medical, not mortal. Miss Whitfield thrives on scandal, but only in print. Captain Sykes our soldier, was seen at dawn, walking the terrace. He seeks to appear disciplined, yet his eyes betray temper. Sykes' moustache bristled. "You dare accuse me?" "I accuse no one yet," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "But passion, Miss Amiss, is a powerful weapon. Kent was not beloved. He toyed with women's affections, threatened men's fortunes. Graves feared financial ruin. Mrs. Graves feared something else. I have watched her, silent, shrinking. But silence can be a shield or a confession." Mrs. Graves flushed, eyes wide, but said nothing. Poirot's voice softened. "And then, there is the matter of the ring. Kent's signet, found in the shallows, not dropped by chance, placed. Why? To remind us of the Swan, the retreat, the very place we stand. Someone wished to tie him irrevocably here, to make the lake his coffin." Poirot's deduction. Poirot clasped his hands. The murderer sought to stage an accident, but arranged too much. The lipstick cup, the pearls, the note, all to many threads. No, the true blow came from one who feared exposure of a more intimate kind. He turned suddenly. "Mrs. Graves." The room drew breath. She shook her head wildly. "No, you're wronged. On the contrary. You knew Kent in London. He courted you, did he not? Promised you escape from a life of duty beside a husband more wedded to law than to love. But Kent was no rescuer, he was a blackmailer. He threatened to reveal your indiscretion unless you gave him money, perhaps more. Last night, you met him. When he pressed too hard, you struck, not with calculation, but with desperation." Her hands flew to her mouth. "I only meant to stop him. He laughed at me." Mr. Graves half rose, his face ashen. "My wife, Impossible. Poirot's gaze was gentle. Not impossible, monsieur. Only tragic. The bruise on Kent's hand tells us he tried to seize her arm. The blow fell in panic. Afterward, she and perhaps another or perhaps you yourself sought to hide the deed by placing him in the lake. But the truth, it floats, always. The breaking pointums. Graves broke then, sobs racking her small frame. Yes, yes, I struck him. He would have ruined me, ruined us both. I thought the water would keep him. Oh, God forgive me. Mr. Graves sank back, face crumbling. Miss Whitfield scribbled furiously, triumphant even in tragedy. Captain Sykes swore under his breath. Mrs. Harcourt closed her eyes, relief and dread mingling. Poirot raised a hand for silence. The law will take its course. But let us remember, desperation is a poor counsellor. One act of folly births a chain of sorrows. Sergeant Wilkes stepped forward, reluctant but steady. Mrs. Graves, I must ask you to come with me. There will be questions, but you'll be treated fairly. She rose, trembling, supported by her husband, whose face bore the grief of a man who has lost both his honour and his partner in one cruel blow. Poirot reflects when they had gone. Poirot sank into a chair, eyes weary now. You see, Hastings, it is as I always tell you. Murder is not born of mystery, but of human weakness. Pride, fear, passion, greed, they make puppets of us all. The little grey cells only reveal the strings. I looked out at the lake. The mist had lifted. The water lay open and pitiless beneath the noon sun. Cabin 13 stood mute at its cove, its role in the drama finished, but its shadow lingering. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, then straightened. Come, Hastings, the play is nearly done. One more act remains to see justice carried through, and then, perhaps, to restore symmetry to the world with a well-arranged vase of flowers. Chapter 9. Justice at dawnth night after Mrs. Graves' confession was restless. Though Sergeant Wilkes had placed her under quiet guard in the lodge, sleep eluded most of the retreat. Guests moved like uneasy phantoms through the lamplit corridors. The pines outside creaked with a sound to like lament. I found Poirot at 3 in the morning, still dressed, sitting upright in an armchair, fingertips together, eyes fixed on the hearth where only faint embers glowed. You cannot sleep either, Hastings? He asked softly. How could I? Poor Mrs. Graves, she hardly seems the stuff of murderers. Just so, Poirot murmured, and yet she struck the blow. Or so she believes, I repeated. He turned those keen eyes upon me. Oui, mon ami. You must understand, guilt confuses itself. A desperate act, an unintended strike, such things weigh heavier in the imagination than in the fact. But I tell you, there is still more to this story. The pattern is not symmetrical. One thread remains untied. I started to argue, but he lifted a hand. Wait until dawn, Hastings, then the shadows will yield. The morning gathering at sunrise. He summoned us all once again to the lounge. Pale faces, reddened eyes, and tense whispers greeted him. Mrs. Graves sat apart, fragile, her husband beside her with a hollow stare. Sergeant Wilkes waited by the window, cap in hand, puzzled but obedient to Poirot's direction. Poirot stood before us, immaculate as ever, though fatigue shadowed his face. His voice, however, carried the same assured calm. Mes amis, he said. We have heard a confession, but not yet the truth. Mrs. Graves struck Kent, yes, but not fatally. Her blow dazed him. Another hand completed the murder. Gasps circled the room. Mrs. Harcourt pressed her pearls. Sykes cursed aloud. Miss Whitfield nearly dropped her notebook. Poirot continued, unhurried. Consider, Kent's wound, neat and decisive, is not the strike of panic. It is the stroke of precision, and the placing of the body, the ring in the shallows, the careful mimicry of accident. These are not the actions of a woman overcome with terror. Non, they belong to one who planned, who calculated, who sought to profit. His gaze swept the room and fixed upon Mr. Lionel Graves. The solicitor's mask. Graves started, then stiffened. Absurd. My wife has already confessed to her part, Poirot said gently, but not to yours. You knew of her indiscretion with Kent. You forgave her, perhaps, but feared exposure. Kent held papers, contracts, promises of financial dealings that could ruin you. He threatened not only your wife's honor, but your livelihood. And so, when she fled the boathouse in horror, you remained. You silenced Kent for good. The solicitor's face mottled red. You dare accuse me without proof. Proof. Poirot lifted a handkerchief. The proof is in the clay upon your shoes. You claimed to retire early, to play chess with your wife. Yet the herringbone imprint near the reeds was yours. Not the captain's, not the doctor's are yours. You returned later, carried Kent to the water, and left the signet ring behind to seal the deception. But you forgot one thing. He opened his palm. There, gleaming faintly, lay a button dark, polished horn, found by the boathouse bench, near the broken pearls. It matches precisely the missing button from your jacket, Monsieur Graves. A hush fell. Graves' mouth opened, closed, then twisted into something between anger and despair. You cannot prove, mon cher, Poirot said softly. It is already proved. Your wife's blow was clumsy. Yours was fatal. She would have lived with shame, perhaps divorce, but you could not live with ruin. So you arranged everything, even her guilt, to shield yourself. You would let her bear the weight of murder, while you remained the grieving husband. But alas, Hercule Poirot was invited. The breaking point. Graves cried out, clutching her husband's arm. Lionel, tell me it isn't true, tell me. But the man's facade cracked. He sank into his chair, face buried in his hands. Yes, he whispered hoarsely. It is true. I finished it. He mocked us both. He held our lives in his hands. I couldn't let him win. Wilkes stepped forward heavily. Then, sir, I must take you into custody. Mrs. Graves sobbed, torn between love and horror. Graves rose, straightened his shoulders, and looked once at her. Forgive me, he said. Before surrendering to the sergeant, Poirot's reflection asterisk. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Miss Whitfield's scratching pen. Poirot sighed, and for a moment seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of human folly. You see, Hastings, he said softly, it is never the grand villain, the master of intrigue. It is always the ordinary man, pressed by pride, by fear, by weakness. Murder, like rust, eats slowly until the final break. I could not answer. My thoughts lingered on the broken figure of Mrs. Graves, who had believed herself a murderess, and on her husband, who had allowed it. Poirot touched my arm. Justice must be done, but compassion must not be forgotten. She struck in panic, he in calculation. The law would distinguish between them, outside. The sun rose higher, scattering the last of the mist. The lake lay calm again, but its surface seemed to bear the memory of what it had concealed. Cabin 13, crouched in its cove, was silent now. Its roll complete, Poirot stood, adjusting his tie. Come, Hastings, we shall pack. The retreat will recover its tranquillity, and we shall return to London. Already I long for order. A vase, a chair, a world without shadows. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. And yet, Hastings, I confess, without shadows. Hercule Poirot would have very little to do. Chapter 10. Justice, at dawn, following dawn, at the retreat, had a peculiar clarity, as if the lake itself wished to cleanse the memory of the night before. Sunlight gilded the pines, each branch glittering with dew, while mist lifted like a shroud being drawn away. Yet inside the lodge, the air was heavy still, thick with grief and resignation. Mr. Lionel Graves had been taken under Sergeant Wilkes' custody, escorted quietly from the premises. He did not struggle. He walked as a man who had already sentenced himself, shoulders stooped but oddly relieved of pretense. His wife, pale and silent, had remained behind, watched over by Mrs. Hartwell with a compassion that surprised me. Miss Whitfield had not slept, her notebook swollen with hurried lines. She cornered me at breakfast with an unseemly gleam in her eyes. It is tragedy, Hastings, but my readers, oh, they will devour it. I snapped that murder was not fodder for cheap fiction. She merely shrugged. Everything is fodder to those who hunger for stories. Poirot, immaculate as always, gently intervened. Mademoiselle, stories may feed the imagination, but truth feeds the soul. Write if you must, but write with respect. For once, she faltered. Chastened. Farewells, and fractious Captain Sykes declared he would leave at once, grumbling of civilian messes and longing for a regiment's order. Dr. Marsh, perhaps fearing his own exposure, departed swiftly too, carrying his practice back to London, muttering of reforms and regrets. Mrs. Harcourt remained aloof, her pearls once again neatly clasped, though the faint crack in her composure betrayed relief that her secret role had been overshadowed by larger guilt. She pressed Poirot's hand lightly. "You will not name me, monsieur." Poirot bowed. "You have heard, madame, but not in blood. Discretion is sometimes the better kindness." The Fenwics, loyal and practical, returned to their duties about the grounds, though I caught Nora gazing at the cove with an expression that mingled sorrow and defiance, as though daring the lake to swallow another secret. Poirot's summation: when the morning was half spent, Poirot called me to the terrace. The water gleamed. Birds trilled as if nothing untoward had passed. Yet Poirot's face was grave. "You see, Hastings," he began, "in every crime there are two deaths, the body and the truth. The first is often swift, the second slow, hidden beneath excuses and lies. Our task is to exhume that second corpse." I nodded, remembering Mrs. Graves' tears, her desperate belief that she had slain Kent, but she did strike him. Oui. A blow of panic. She thought it mortal, and so confessed. Yet it was her husband who saw opportunity, money, reputation, control. His was the precise strike, the calculation, the staging. In this, you see the symmetry. Passion begins, calculation completes, and Kent himself. He brought ruin by his own vices, exactiment. He sought to manipulate all: Mrs. Harcourt with desire, Mrs. Graves with promises, Marsh with threats, Graves with contracts. He built a web, and in it he was caught. Poirot's moustaches quivered. But one does not excuse the other. Weakness in the victim does not absolve the crime. The retreat rested by noon. Order began to reassert itself. The staff scrubbed the pier. The cabins were aired, and Mrs. Hartwell arranged roses in bowls, as if to overwrite memory with fragrance. She thanked Poirot with a curiously formal gratitude,